I want you to picture this scenario. You are a member of your country's national legislature, and a very important vote is coming up. Now, you know that your side has the majority, meaning that in a perfect world where every member of the chamber shows up to vote, you win. But in this scenario, not everyone is there to vote, but the vote takes place anyway. So now, you're in a situation where you are in the majority, but your side doesn't have the required number of votes and will therefore lose. Does this seem fair to you? Well, it might be fair if you believe that it's the responsibility of these legislators to be present for big votes when it's their job. On the other hand, you could say that, well, it's not fair to you that you are in the majority, yet you lose because the vote took place at a point in time when not enough of you were there to vote. What exactly is the right thing to do in this situation? Do we still hold the vote? Do we wait? How long do we wait? And how long is too long? It can't be forever. This was the dilemma Chile had to face back in 2021 in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the way in which one politician chose to answer this dilemma opened up a never-ending question over how the hell we should even be handling democratic politics. But if we want to understand the institutional chaos, it's important that we go over some context. In January 2010, Sebastián Piñera became the president of Chile after winning the election in the second round. Now, Chile allows multi-term presidents, but they can't be consecutive terms. So after Piñera's term ended in 2014, he abstained from running and then won the subsequent election to begin his second term in 2018. It was during this term that Piñera's public image began to crumble. In 2019, a protest movement known as the Estallido Social broke out nationwide, and they demanded that Piñera resign as president. The government's response to the protests was heavily criticized for the use of excessive force in violation of human rights. But I mean, come on, let's not act surprised. This kind of thing happens all the time. Anyway, the result was an unsuccessful attempt to impeach President Piñera. Moving forward 2 years, in 2021, Piñera faced a second impeachment attempt, this time with a bit more momentum behind it. On October 3rd, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists began publishing the findings of one of the largest investigations in its history, which came to be known as the Pandora Papers. The leak included millions of documents totaling 2.94 terabytes of data. It exposed the offshore bank accounts, hidden assets, fraud, undisclosed transactions, and other secret financial activity of many prominent global figures. They named a number of sitting and former world leaders, people like President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan, King Abdullah II of Jordan, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, Prime Minister Tony Blair of the United Kingdom, and of course, William F. and of course, President Sebastián Piñera of Chile. Piñera's name appeared in the Pandora Papers because of what he did during his first term. Piñera's children owned a 33.3% stake in a mining company, and he intended to sell those shares to one of his friends through an offshore shell company. In Piñera's first year in office, a deal was made for $138 million to sell the shares in 3 installments, and that last payment would only be made on the condition that President Piñera would not allow any moves that would prevent the development of the Dominga mining project. This meant blocking any proposal for something like a wildlife reserve in the area. This misuse of the powers of the presidency was a terrible look for Piñera, and his opponents began making plans for a second impeachment attempt. But who were his opponents? So Chile operates under a multi-party system in which coalitions of parties can be formed and reorganized every so often. Piñera himself was elected from the Chile Vamos coalition, formed out of a group of right-wing and center-right parties. And despite having a president from that coalition, they controlled less than half of the seats in both legislative houses. 69 out of 155 seats in the Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house, and 19 out of 41 in the Senate, which is the upper house. Most seats were controlled by the 2 opposition coalitions. Unidad Constituyente, a somewhat mixed coalition that generally leans center-left, and Apruebo Dignidad, a solid left-wing coalition. Now, with these 2 opposition coalitions combined, they controlled a majority of seats in the Senate. The Chamber of Deputies was a different story. The 2 coalitions together controlled 75 seats, which is more than what Chile Vamos had, but it was still less than 78, which is the number required to hold a majority. Remember that fact for later. So now we know who Piñera's opponents were. When the news of the Pandora Papers came out, a criminal investigation was opened up on Piñera, and on October 13th, deputies from across the opposition launched their bid to impeach Piñera. This impeachment came at a very critical time. 2021 was an election year, with the election set to take place on November 21st, just over a month away. And a second impeachment so close to the end of Piñera's term, well, that was exactly the reason why the bid was heavily rushed. The sooner they began the lengthy process to impeach Piñera, the more likely it was that they'd be able to take the vote before the election. So think about it for a second. If the conservative Piñera could be impeached successfully before the election, it might boost the candidate representing a leftist coalition, such as Gabriel Boric. We'll get to him soon. From this, it seems like this impeachment was motivated by both the genuine concern over Piñera's misuse of power and also by the desire for political gain. Anyway, the opposition was successful in getting their early vote date, which was set for November 8th. Here, on November 8th, 2021, in the Chilean Chamber of Deputies, the scenario I showed you at the beginning comes into play. In order to impeach the president, a majority of deputies must vote in favor. That's at least 78 out of 155. At the time the vote was set to take place, the number of deputies ready to vote to impeach Piñera was 79. Or rather, that's what it would have been. 5 days earlier, Gabriel Boric, a member of the Apruebo Dignidad coalition and a major candidate in the upcoming election, was diagnosed with COVID-19. It was 2021, after all. That brings us down to 78. Another deputy, Giorgio Jackson, had been in contact with Boric prior to his diagnosis, and so he would have to remain in isolation until November 9th, the day after the impeachment vote. So at this point, we're down to 77, and the opposition no longer has the required majority. To make matters worse, Diego Paulsen, the president of the Chamber of Deputies, rejected the possibility of Boric and Jackson being allowed to vote remotely. Okay, so things are not looking good for the opposition, but there is still a way out of this. What they need is for the vote to simply be delayed for another day so that Giorgio Jackson can finish his quarantine and return to the chamber. How can we do this? Well, what if I told you there was a way for a single member of the legislature to delay the vote indefinitely simply by talking and extending the debate for as long as they can? Yep, that's right, we're doing another filibuster video because the last one went nowhere. What are you going to do about it? But hold on a second. We're in Chile, not the United States. What does a filibuster look like there? So, in cases where a public official, such as the president, faces impeachment in an acusación constitucional, or constitutional accusation, the two figures representing the accusation and the defense are allowed to speak indefinitely, while all other members of the chamber have a limited debate time. This allows time for the two to fully make their case. But if given the right opportunity, this rule can easily lead to political shenanigans. This was the case back in 1993 when some Supreme Court ministers were facing impeachment, but those in favor of impeachment were one vote short, prompting Jorge Ulloa to speak for 6 hours to allow the missing member to make their way back to the chamber to vote. It was the longest recorded speech in the history of the chamber and was extremely controversial. But now, it was going to make a return. So as I mentioned, only the main accuser and defender may speak for as long as they please. In other words, the success of the impeachment would rest entirely on the shoulders of the member who presents the accusation. And that individual was Jaime Naranjo from the Unidad Constituyente coalition. When it was revealed that Boric had COVID and Jackson would be in isolation until November 9th, the scheduled date for the vote had already been in place. So, the day after the diagnosis, Naranjo gave his fateful announcement.
Entonces, vamos a aplicar la ley Lázaro hasta que los enfermos caminen. Un parlamentario puede tomar la palabra y puede estar hablando 48 horas, 72 horas en la sala y nada lo impide. Por consiguiente, vamos a aplicar la ley Lázaro hasta que los enfermos caminen. Puedo hablar 72, 92, 5 días si es por acusar a Piñera y por sacar adelante la acusación constitucional puedo estar hablando un mes.
The so-called Ley Lázaro, or Lazarus Law, was named after Saint Lazarus of Bethany, a biblical figure who, in the New Testament, was miraculously resurrected by Jesus after having been dead for 4 days. The idea here is that Naranjo stalling for time using his unlimited accusation speech will revive Jackson's presence in the chamber. Now, to be clear, this law doesn't actually exist on the books, but it is merely the name given to the parliamentary loophole. And that loophole was set to begin at 10:24 a.m. on the morning of November 8, 2021. Jaime Naranjo began speaking to present the accusation against Piñera. His end goal was to speak until Jackson returned to the chamber, meaning he'd have to delay the vote until at least midnight, plus however long it takes Jackson to go from his home to the chamber. That's a minimum of 13.5 hours. As with any filibuster, you need to be able to have some way to pass the time. So what Naranjo did was procure a 1,300-page version of the accusation and use that as his main source of reading material. But Naranjo's stalling tactics weren't just about giving a lengthy speech. Some of his strategies were pretty controversial. It wasn't even an hour and a half into his speech when Jaime Naranjo and his allies started trying to weaponize the quorum rule. So if the number of members in the chamber is too low, the session is not allowed to continue until the required quorum is present. Naranjo's party often called into question the number of deputies present and would request Chamber President Paulsen to provide the correct amount. This would become extremely repetitive throughout the filibuster, and Paulsen would get increasingly disinterested each time.
Presidente, yo no le he dicho a nadie que se vaya a la sala y apenas hay 39 diputados presentes. Pido quórum.
Una vez que se cumplan los 5 minutos de haber sonado el timbre, podré suspender la sesión. Por lo tanto, los timbres están sonando hace 2 minutos, quedan 3 minutos, si es que no llegan los parlamentarios, se va a suspender la sesión, pero por el momento usted puede seguir haciendo lectura de lo que está leyendo hace 9 horas.
Están sonando es que me llama la atención, presidente, perdón que lo interrumpa. Me llama la atención que el secretario no le advierta a usted que no hay quórum en la sala y que haga sonar los timbres. Cuando el secretario debiera advertirle.
Silencio, por favor. Silencio, por favor.
¿Qué dije, no?
Silencio, por favor. Que diputado 52 es el tercio.
52, está bien.
Cuando baje de 52 a 51, no está el quórum. Disculpe, diputado Naranjo.
No, presidente, ya estoy acostumbrado ya a que me interrumpan.
Quiero dejar súper claro que yo no he sido que lo he interrumpido y le he ofrecido incluso poder hacer el receso si usted lo necesita ahora.
No, presidente.
Perfecto.
Vamos a seguir.
This pattern was likely rooted in what happened around noon, where Naranjo was caught trying to go a bit too far in his obstructionism.
Ya, presidente, yo le diría al secretario que está siendo ministro de Fe que cuente los diputados que están presentes en la sala, porque a mí no me dan 57. No me dan 57.
No ponen lo que hay realmente.
Salgan ustedes para que no es 57.
Diputado Naranjo, tampoco. Diputado Naranjo, yo le pido que por favor no incite que salgan diputados también de la sala.
Pero no hay 57. No hay. Ya. Hay 59.
Me acaban de decir, diputada, acabo de contar y acaba de ingresar la diputada Fernanda, hay 55 parlamentarios. Por favor, dejemos de hacer show porque además, mire, si quieren voy a poner el video que tengo aquí donde el propio diputado Naranjo pide que salga gente para que no haya quórum. ¿Quieren hacer de esto un show? Por favor. Yo creo que es suficiente con lo que tenemos.
This attempt to halt the session served as great ammunition for critics of Naranjo, who did not appreciate the use of filibuster tactics. But there was something else that was about to present an even greater test to the credibility of not just Naranjo, but the entire opposition. After Naranjo was allowed a 15-minute break at 3:50 p.m., during which he was checked on by a doctor, some news came in. Jorge Savage, a member of a party within the Unidad Constituyente coalition, announced that he wasn't feeling well, and he would be absent from the chamber to await the results of a PCR test. This brought the number of available opposition voters down to 76. It was no longer enough to simply wait until Jackson returned. Now, they had to wait on the results of Savage's PCR test, which could take multiple days. I'm sure Jaime Naranjo would have been perfectly willing to pursue his Ley Lázaro at all costs, but something tells me that extending the filibuster any longer than a couple of days would have been too brazen, especially in a country like Chile, which, unlike the United States, did not see the filibuster normalize in its political history, and thus would have a much stronger reaction to it.
Yo no sé a quién se le pudo ocurrir, en qué borrachera, que meterle más inestabilidad al sistema político era conveniente para las candidaturas presidenciales de la oposición.
Anyway, when it was revealed that Jorge Savage would be away from the chamber until the results of his PCR test came out, members of his party, the Christian Democrats, or the Partido Demócrata Cristiano, quickly mobilized to pressure him into returning to the chamber before the test result came out. Since COVID-19 still had a presence in Chile, this move proved to be extremely unpopular, as the opposition was accused of putting the other members of the chamber at risk simply for the sake of winning the vote. But when it was all said and done, Savach promised he would be back around midnight. And just for the record, his tests would come back negative. Now, if we could just circle back to our main protagonist, just after 8:20 p.m. on November 8th, around 9.5 hours into the speech, we can see Naranjo taking a moment to eat, and he engages in a bit of lighthearted beef with Chamber President Bolson.
Si quiere puede terminar de comer para que se escuche bien.
No, presidente. No estoy comiendo, presidente. No estoy comiendo, presidente, y si quisiera comer, podría comer también.
No podría comer, diputado, pero no hay problema. Coma.
Yo le pido, presidente, que usted esté a la altura del cargo que está asignado ahí y que no se involucre en la discusión de esta acusación constitucional. Usted está ahí para mantener la imparcialidad. Y yo he visto que reiteradamente en esta sesión usted ha tenido una conducta no propia de ser el presidente de esta corporación.
Diputado, por favor, siga haciendo lectura de su informe.
Permanentemente se está mofando, haciendo burlas de mi intervención. Eso no es propio de una autoridad. Pero claro, usted tiene el ejemplo, el presidente. ¿Qué vamos a hacer?
Over the course of Naranjo's filibuster, when he wasn't eating, drinking, or rage-baiting his political opponents, Naranjo would read from his 1,300-page accusation, which included topics such as environmental protection, the Humboldt penguin native to Chile, the Pandora Papers, and President Piñera's alleged corruption exposed therein. He talks about upholding the national honor by keeping leadership accountable, and he would often make attempts to aggrandize the impeachment of Piñera.
Se los repito, a ver si acaso lo entienden bien.
En la cueva del Ibabá.
La declaración de algún mandatario de un país que condene abiertamente los beneficios tributarios de los paraísos fiscales y paralelamente su familia mantenga su fortuna radicada en uno de ellos.
Qué vergüenza, qué vergüenza. Como nosotros.
Eso, señor presidente, en Chile tiene nombre hoy día. Se llama Miguel Juan Sebastián Piñera Echenique.
Era él.
Despite it all, he was still within his rights to speak indefinitely, and so on and on he went. Finally, 13.5 hours into his filibuster, we reach midnight, November 9th.
Norma del Corpus Juris internacional adicionales al protocolo de San Salvador. Sí.
Now that the day is November 9th, it means that technically, Yorio Jackson's quarantine has expired, and he wasted no time. It's approximately 75 miles, or 121 kilometers, from Jackson's home in Santiago to the chamber in Valparaíso. Over an hour of driving. So now, it was a matter of Naranjo speaking until Jackson showed up to the chamber to be able to secure the deciding vote. At around 12:45 a.m., Naranjo completely loses any respect I had for him when he raises his glass and takes a sip of what is clearly piss. As time went on, Naranjo began wrapping up his filibuster. He returned to the core topic of the Pandora Papers, and at around 1:24 a.m. on November 9th, Yorio Jackson had arrived at the chamber, and Jaime Naranjo gave his closing remarks.
Más lejos, no solo involucra al Estado chileno con sus intereses comerciales, sino aún más daña el honor de la nación. Nunca antes en la historia de este país un presidente de la República en el ejercicio de su cargo había sido acusado por dos cosas tan graves como es haber violado los derechos humanos y a su vez haber comprometido el honor de la nación. Pero eso yo espero que esta sala apruebe la acusación constitucional. Si no, el país juzgará a aquellos parlamentarios que se opusieron o votaron en contra. Chile juzgará y el pueblo de Chile juzgará a aquellos que están permitiendo esta impunidad en el país. He dicho, señor presidente.
Soon after Naranjo finished his remarks, it was time for the defense to begin their speech. The defense was presented by President Piñera's lawyer, Jorge Galvez. His speech was frequently interrupted, but he was able to get his points out. Among many other things, Galvez mentions that many of the actions Piñera was accused of had already been investigated and clarified, and he maintained that there was nothing that Piñera was proven to have actually done that was unconstitutional. Galvez also made sure to point out the timing of the impeachment in an attempt to discredit the movement as purely a political move.
Una acusación constitucional, sepámoslo, no es una denuncia. No es un acto a través del cual se pone en conocimiento un hecho que podría eventualmente revestir los caracteres de un ilícito constitucional que eventualmente podría configurarse. Denunciar un hecho a una persona cuando no se tiene certeza, asumiendo la posibilidad de que se trate de un hecho inefectivo, es un acto de extrema irresponsabilidad, pero además es un acto ilícito. El hecho de que estemos hoy, a pocos días de la elección parlamentaria y presidencial, discutiendo esta acusación constitucional no es casualidad.
When all was said and done, and Galvez had spoken for over 5 hours, it was time for the chamber to vote on the impeachment. As was anticipated, the opposition won the vote with the bare minimum 78 votes in favor of impeachment. 67 members voted against, 3 abstained, and the rest were absent. Once the vote went to the Senate, the impeachment attempt pretty much died out when the upper house voted against the impeachment. Unlike the Chamber of Deputies, which only needs a simple majority, the Senate requires a 2/3 majority of 29 votes out of 43 seats. The two opposition coalitions had 23 members combined, so yeah, tough luck, fellas. I don't know how much of an effect the impeachment had on the outcome of the 2021 Chilean election set to take place on November 21st. But if we take into account the severe damage to Piñera's reputation after the estallido social, and the fact that the impeachment attempt occurred in the midst of the political campaigning for the upcoming election, it's not hard to see how the Chilean political scene had grown more tense. The two leading candidates in the election were sent by two coalitions who were fairly solid on their sides of the political spectrum. Gabriel Boric, who you're already familiar with, represented Apruebo Dignidad, which we know to be a leftist coalition, and José Antonio Cast represented the Christian Social Front, a right-wing populist coalition. Both of these candidates represented political fronts that were further away from the political center than those who led in 2017. Cast initially had the most votes in the first round, but after the other candidates were eliminated, it was Boric who had the majority in the second round and was elected president. And so that about wraps up the story of this political episode. And I could stop the video here if I wanted to, but there is more that I want to go over. Jaime Naranjo's 15-hour filibuster is the longest reported speech in the history of the chamber, and I'm willing to believe that the government of Chile really didn't know what to do about this. It was controversial enough for Jorge Ulloa to speak for 6 hours back in 1993, but in the age of social media, a 15-hour speech really got people talking. For those who were less serious about politics but were nonetheless interested, they took great pleasure in memeing the situation in order to express just how baffled they were at the absolute state of their political process. For many Chileans, this was completely new, and it was viewed as this weird anomaly that isn't normally seen. Although as an American, a filibuster is just a regular Tuesday. Of course, there was serious opposition to Naranjo's use of filibuster tactics. Sebastián Torrealba, a member of the Chile Vamos coalition, was very vocal, accusing Naranjo of turning the Chamber of Deputies into a political circus, and he was strongly opposed to the fact that Naranjo was even allowed to make this kind of move, stating, "Shameful. Even the citizens themselves find this pathetic, and once again it tarnishes the image of an institution as important as Congress. But, well, we're used to this kind of show and circus for quite some time now." It should be noted that these strong reactions were also in the context of Naranjo trying to block quorum by telling nearby members to leave the chamber.
Salgan ustedes para que no es 57.
Even as someone who has no issue with the filibuster, yeah, that's not a good look. Bill Maher would never pull a trick like that. Anyway, I think the most interesting criticism of the filibuster came from Nicolás Noman, another member of the Chile Vamos coalition. It's a bad strategy because at the end of the day, what it does is further discredit politics as a whole, as well as the political class. So basically, in order to impeach the president, you have to talk for 13 or 14 hours. It really isn't well-founded. I find this quote particularly interesting because it's both right and wrong. It's wrong because when you put the filibuster in context, we know that there were enough members to vote in favor of the impeachment. Naranjo only came to use the filibuster because Boric was diagnosed with COVID-19, causing Jackson to also be unable to vote. It's not entirely fair to doubt the filibuster, but at the same time I do see some truth to the quote because, honestly, should the filibuster really have been the only option? See, what I'm trying to get at here is one of the things I really don't enjoy about democracy. You can't say for certain that the outcome of a vote is actually representative of the underlying population, due to the fact that voting is voluntary. Heck, you can't even be certain that the composition of a legislative chamber is proportional to the voters, let alone the population. But let's say, hypothetically, it is proportional, that this is a perfect legislature that is perfectly representative. Even then, you can't reasonably expect every member of the chamber to be present for every single vote. Members get sick, they can die, they can leave their seat vacant, they have emergencies, they get assassinated in the middle of a foreign jungle. Maybe in a country like Barbados, where the House of Assembly has only 30 members, it's far more likely for there to be perfect attendance. But Chile's Chamber of Deputies had 155 seats, and as we saw, not everyone was there for the impeachment vote because of COVID-19 and the inability to vote remotely. Now I'm going to ask you to recall what I said at the start of the video, and combine it with the assumption that we live in a perfect society where the legislature is as proportionally representative as it gets. So just forget about Chile for a second, forget about Naranjo, forget about the impeachment of Piñera. This is purely hypothetical. If most citizens prefer outcome A, and most members of the legislature accordingly also prefer outcome A, we should expect outcome A to win the vote with no legal, political, or ethical concerns. It's just democracy at work. Okay, but what if not all members are present? And let's say that the absent members were those who were going to vote yes for outcome A. Now, we've got a situation where most people want something to happen, yet the government doesn't do it. This is obviously not a desirable way for a government to function, so we can introduce some rules to prevent this from happening. For example, we don't want a vote to fail just because not enough people were there to vote, so we introduce a quorum rule, which requires a certain minimum number of members to be present in order for the legislature to be able to do business. Now, we can't require all members of a legislature to be present. Yeah, it's their job, they work for the people, but I don't think any reasonable American expects 435 people to always be present for every time the House of Representatives does anything. That's simply not practical. Okay, so our quorum should be low enough to allow legislative activity even when some members are absent. But we can't have it be too low, or else the outcome of the vote cannot be considered legitimate. I mean, we're not going to have a situation where you can still meet and do business with less than half of the members present. Oh wait, there is a country that does that. Remember when Jaime Naranjo was trying to get people to leave so that there wouldn't be a quorum? Yeah, what number did he say?
Salgan ustedes para que no hay 57.
57? Out of a total 155? Alright, look, I'm not Chilean, so this doesn't concern me. Whatever. So let's say that we have a quorum for our hypothetical legislature that has a reasonable amount of people, and that it's a Goldilocks zone that lies somewhere between 51 and 99%. Great. Now let's say that this imaginary country has political parties that see genuine competition between each other. What if, for instance, there is a majority party which controls a number of seats in the legislature that is more than half, but less than the quorum? This means that if the opposing party or parties are strongly against what the majority party wants to do, they could simply leave and prevent a quorum in order to block the action. This is exactly what Texas Democrats did back in August 2025, using the disappearing quorum strategy to delay a plan by the Republican Party to redraw congressional districts in their favor. Now, as fascinated as I am with political obstructionism, regardless of political party, not everyone appreciates seeing things like the filibuster or a disappearing quorum. Okay, so we want to be serious. We want a serious legislature with no shenanigans. Politics is serious business. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. Fine. So what? We ban the filibuster. How do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. Just make it so that members have a limit on how long they can speak. That's no fun, but it works. But what about the disappearing quorum? We can't enforce perfect attendance, but we also don't want people intentionally leaving to prevent action. How do we do that? Put a rule that says no member shall leave the chamber for purposes of breaking quorum. Right, but that would mean you have to make the distinction between someone who is intentionally breaking quorum and someone who actually has an excusable reason to be absent, like sickness or a family emergency. And it would also mean that you're going after people who are specifically trying to break quorum. We're not even talking about abstentionists, which are members of a legislature who occupy a seat but never actually participate. One example being the Sinn Féin party in the British House of Commons. But how significant is it that 7 people are always absent from a chamber which has a total of 650 seats? What are we supposed to do? And hey, maybe it's their right as an elected official. Because if you vote for an abstentionist party, you're fully aware they don't actually intend on doing anything. So forcing them not to abstain would technically be undemocratic. So now, for our hypothetical legislature, we got a situation where we allow abstentionism, but we're not allowed to break quorum. So for the required quorum of the legislature, you have to take into account the number of abstentionists who will always be absent. Then you have to consider that the abstentionist party might occupy a different number of seats after every election. So what you have to do is just gotta change the quorum depending on the number of abstentionists. But in order to keep track of it, you have to make a distinction between parties and members who are full-time abstentionists or simply abstaining for one particular reason.
If we can have order in the chamber so that the members can properly cast their vote.
We resume what day? Put it back.
Howdy, I'm Paticor, and I hope you can hear me over the traffic and the wind. I'm standing here in front of the College Station, Texas City Hall, because it's an easy government building that I can go to film the ending of this video. And if you're wondering, yes, that last clip was of a Jordanian MP firing off an AK-47 in the hallway just outside of the Parliament chamber. I'm filming this ending in the same way that I did the endings of the History of War series, where I would kind of just ramble on, semi-scripted, but mostly based off of from the heart. I want to redo the ending of this video because the ending I originally wrote was not very good. It was kind of a non-ending, and there are some things that I wanted to say differently this time, given the recent events around the time that I finished editing this video and filming this. Although I might have uploaded it later, so the relevance of it might be a little bit outdated, but something tells me that the environment of what happened is still present, at least in the United States, so I'm going to go ahead with it. Now, those clips I played at the end of me making fun of the chaos of certain legislatures was me trying to convey a point that there is no possible way to properly create a perfectly orderly government as long as there are humans in the mix. That's what always happens. Because we as humans care so deeply about the laws that we are going to all live under collectively that we will resort to anger, fistfights, violence. That's sort of why I'm such a big fan of things like the filibuster or a disappearing quorum or obstructionism in general, because those are pretty disruptive, sometimes controversial, but ultimately non-violent. You know, violence is very dramatic. It's very obviously dramatic. There's not much that is dramatic about the filibuster, just talking. Jaime Naranjo made a very big ruckus out of his filibuster, but when you really think about it, all he was actually doing was talking for 15 hours. He was talking to his allies, his opponents, and he was talking to the people. And that's something I think is very, very important. As a legislator, Naranjo was using the tools at his disposal. And oftentimes when politicians are trying to deal with something that they find appalling. What do? Well, they can do what Naranjo did. They can filibuster. They can use shenanigans to block the measure. They can go on social media. They can spread the word. They can talk. Humans are very, very good at talking. Language is kind of our whole thing. Sharing information is kind of our whole thing. But sometimes talking can be a little bit too good. We are too good at sharing information. I mean, everyone can share information. That's what I'm doing right now. You can say anything. You can phrase something in the right way, under the right conditions, at the right time. And people can believe just about anything. And I think one of the most dangerous things, if not the most dangerous thing that a person can believe, is that they're done talking. Because when we don't have speech, when we don't have talking, communication, the next best thing that humans have that they are very good at is violence. But we're not very big fans of violence either. We try to cast it aside as a last resort option. We only use violence when we think it's okay, when we think it's necessary. And so, in order to use violence, we have to do a sort of mental gymnastics. We have to dehumanize the person that we are using violence against. Because we don't normally use violence against other people. We have to come up with some idea in our heads that can make us look at that person and say, that person is not worthy of empathy, they are unworthy of humanity, they are worthy of being targeted. And when that starts to happen, a very horrible cycle can build. You can have two people, or two sides, two groups, two entities, let's say. And, one of them can believe, or both of them can believe, that the other side is out to get them. They are brain-dead, heartless monsters that will do anything in their power to make the other group's life miserable. And say, you know what, we need to do something about it before they do something to us. So let's say one of those groups or individuals makes a move in an attempt to deal with whatever threat they perceive. That side that just got attacked is now going to take that and say, aha, look at that, they are in fact out to get us. Now, how are we going to respond to that? And depending on how they respond, that's where that dangerous cycle can begin. Because then, maybe, heaven forbid, there is retaliation. The side that is facing the retaliation now says, okay, now they're after us. It's not a very good slope to be on. It's slippery. And one of the most dangerous outcomes of that is, again, the loss of perception of humanity. Now, I know most people are not like that. I know most people, we're just trying to live our lives. We may disagree, but you're moderates. You're moderates. You're not interested in the extremism, in the division that some of the loudest people have. But unfortunately, many of the people in power, the people with the most amount of influence, do see and are on the side of that division. And it can come in a lot of different forms, and we see it all the time. For example, Israel, who dehumanizes all Palestinians using Hamas as an excuse. Or evangelicals, who dehumanize queer people based on a very flawed perception of who they actually are. Or progressives, who so easily dehumanize people who are far-right populists because they cannot fathom that someone can arrive at a belief system that is so dangerous, so hateful, casually ignoring that nobody is born believing what they believe. And it was a very gradual process. They started from a point of zero. We're very quick to forget that we are all just people who arrive at a conclusion because we may have seen something that the other person did not see. And so we say, okay, well, you know what? They don't have any respect for anyone. They don't have any respect for me. And so I'm not going to respect them. If something bad were to happen to that person, I am going to treat them with the same amount of respect that they would have treated me had I been victimized. You can say, well, we welcome death. We welcome the death of that person. That's a very dangerous thing to believe. Now, I don't want to stand here on some imaginary moral shiny pedestal and say that I haven't felt a little bit of relief when someone that I didn't like was hurt or died. But I also do have the sense to understand and recognize that that is not a healthy thought for me to have in my mind. Regardless of what I think, I do want to see the best in people. And you and I, we need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves if we really are trying to understand the things or the people that we find appalling. I remember one time when I attended a pro-Palestine protest on campus, and we did meet a counter-demonstrator, came in with an Israel flag, clearly looking to disagree with us. And one of the people in our group went over to talk to them. They were having a very heated conversation, as that issue could get. And then I hear from across the plaza someone telling that person, hey, don't waste your breath. Well, I say, you should waste your breath. Jaime Naranjo must have known that the Chilean Senate was going to reject the impeachment of President Sebastián Piñera. He must have known that technically his filibuster would not have accomplished anything. He must have known that he was wasting his breath, but he did it anyway. He wasted his breath for 15 hours for nothing. And I do have a lot of respect for that. It can seem hard. It can seem completely pointless. But you must keep trying to communicate. We must keep doing what humans are so good at and socialize in both directions. You probably can't change someone's mind on an individual conversation. But if you and another person can exchange even just a quarter ounce of nuance, if you can catch the 1 second where a broken clock is correct, I think that's worth it. But that can only work if you both try. That requires at least 2 people. So if you're not trying, there's a siren. So if you're not trying, you're not gonna get anywhere. If I'm not trying, I'm not gonna get anywhere. I remember 2 interesting conversations I had at going to pro-Palestine rallies. I've only ever personally been approached 2 times by people who disagreed with me. One of them was a sort of, not really interested in the issue, but more of trying to counter one of the things we said. And it was a pretty lively conversation. It was fine. And another conversation I had was with someone who clearly disagreed with me. And without going into too much detail on what the disagreement was about, what I will say is that when he gave me something to think about, I was doing my best not to treat it as a competition, as, oh man, he just said something. What can I say to beat him, to get back at him? No, I said, wow, that's an interesting thing he just said. Let me try to voice my thoughts and see what he thinks. Neither of us were threatening each other. We were just kind of laying our ideas on the table. The beliefs we had in our heads were at odds, were in competition. But both of us, we were free. We were free. There was no hostility among me and that person. The one thing we have that can allow us to accomplish this is something I apparently believed since I was very little. It's something I screamed out in a moment of anger, and it's something that my mom really likes to quote a lot because she thought it was really funny. And it's kind of ironic what I said, considering that I very easily got mad at people when I was a little kid. It's a very simple piece of advice that I think we should all keep in mind. ¡Hay que tener paciencia! God bless.